Iran's legislature has voted to close the Strait of Hormuz pending the approval of the supreme leader, and the United States is freaking out. For those who don't know, the Strait of Hormuz is this narrow body of water that actually controls the flow of 20% of the world's oil supply. And it just so happens that Iran is in complete control of that strait. Now, we know the United States is freaking out about this because in a recent interview, Marco Rubio said that the United States would be willing to appeal to China to have them interfere and stop Iran from closing the strait. Because yeah, China does have a vested interest in that strait as well, considering 50% of their oil supply flows through that strait.
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. And we retain options to deal with that. But other countries should be looking at that as well. It would hurt other countries' economies a lot worse than ours. It would be, I think, a massive escalation that would merit a response, not just by us, but from others.
Yeah, but there are a couple of things to unpack here with that statement. You don't think Iran knows that China needs this strait to remain open? And you don't think China knows that? And you don't think China was well aware that this was a calculated risk that Iran would have to take, which is probably why they sent ballistic missile technology to Iran in January? And yeah, I guess you could try to appeal to China, but who do you think China would side with in this situation? Because yeah, the hit to China would be massive, but it would be temporary if Iran were able to overcome this aggression from the United States and Israel. Not to mention there would be some logistical issues. However, they could just open the strait for China. But also, do you think that China is more worried about a temporary hit to their economy or a permanent hit via regime change that we all know the United States is trying to engage in? So yeah, of course, China will probably say they don't want them to close the strait. However, they're aware of the situation that Iran is in, and they don't want to lose their economic ally to regime change, while the United States is actively threatening them every single day. And then there's the part where Iran is fully aware of how important this strait is, and that yeah, the United States might not be as affected economically as the rest of the world, even though they still would be, but the United States allies would be decimated economically, incentivizing them to intervene and demand a ceasefire in order for their economies to survive, regardless of where they stand in their relationships with either Iran or the United States. Understand, if Iran closes this strait, prices of oil barrels would rise from roughly $75 to $130 to $150 per barrel. What that means for you as a consumer is that your gas prices would increase about $1 to $2 per gallon if you live in the US, and the supply chain would be wrecked. So all of your goods will become more expensive than they already are. Now, many people warn that US aggression towards Iran would lead to an economic crash. And this is one of the ways that that would happen. The United States was aware that this was always a possibility, and yet and still they decided to attack Iran under the false pretext of nuclear weapons that they don't have anyway. Now, you will hear a counterpoint to this, that Iran's economy would be hurt. However, they already took a 20% dip in GDP because of the sanctions put on them in 2018 after Trump put out the JCPOA. They've had more sanctions put on them since then. And think about it. Do you feel like they fear a temporary dip in their economy as a part of a strategic long-term move to bring peace to their region, or a permanent economic problem brought about by a total regime change where we know the United States and the UK and Israel and their allies would control the strait, and Iran would probably see little to none of that money? And to put a fine point on the matter, I wouldn't really be counting on China to intervene in any significant way, considering Iran has actually been exporting oil through the black market to China for years. So yeah, I wouldn't really count on China to come to y'all rescue. But I will tell you this, I'm sure that Iran is praying for y'all to retaliate if they close the strait instead of negotiating, because This isn't 1988, and this isn't Operation Praying Mantis, Iran. This is 2025. We just let off some hypersonic missiles that Israel could do nothing about, and y'all just had to sit there and watch it happen, Iran. And considering how strategic militarily Iran has been as of late, if they're willing to make this gamble, it's probably because they know they have a royal flush, and they're just waiting on y'all to make a stupid move for them to take all the chips.